Make no mistake, if Rhaenrya ever sit the Iron Throne, it will be Lord Fleabottom who rules us, a king consort as cruel and unforgiving as Maegor ever was. My own head will be the first cut off, I do not doubt, but your queen, my daughter, will soon follow Otto Hightower to the Green Council. Fire and blood, the dying of the dragons, the blacks and the greens. Something I think that makes the wider history and lore of Westeros feel so real is the way George R. R. Martin has constructed his conflicts. Specifically, how they form slowly over time, just like in real-world history. When you break down many historical conflicts and events, they can be traced back to some kind of broken relationship or mislike between two people. These huge conflicts that change the course of history in their origin are the personal ambitions of individuals that grew as the person became more influential, and that is very much the case with the Dance of the Dragons. While there is no one single thing that caused the Targaryen Civil War to happen, in its formative stages, large parts of the personal animosity between the two factions that grew out of the conflict comes from the personal dislike of two men and the struggle for power between them, and of course, just as importantly, the favour of King Viserys. We are of course talking about the troubled relationship between Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, and the King's brother, Prince Daemon Targaryen, the Rogue Prince, something that started as a petty mislike of each other to becoming key figures in the Dance of the Dragons, were lots of the negatives of their past relationship, fueling how bitter the war became. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the relationship between Daemon and Otto, and trying to figure out why exactly the two men hated each other so much from the get-go. There are two distinctions we must make very clear when dealing with this topic. Firstly, it's the concept of canon within the works of George R. R. Martin. He never has really been a huge fan of discussing canon, but the one thing he has always been fundamentally clear of is that the HBO shows are very much their own distinct thing, and choices made by the writers of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon do not necessarily reflect the events that may or may not happen in the books. This idea gets complicated in terms of the show for two reasons. With Game of Thrones, not only were huge parts of the story cut, when they did pass the books, it became hard to really say how much of what the show was doing was in any way similar to what George R. R. Martin will do if he ever publishes The Winds of Winter. We know the broad strokes may be similar, and a few key events such as Hodor holding the door and R+L=J are basically confirmed for the books at this point. Outside of a few key elements such as this, it's hard to really apply anything that happened in the show to the book. The second point is related directly to House of the Dragon. The text itself is intentionally vague and written from conflicting accounts, with the idea being it's up to the reader to determine what they think truly happens. Each reader has their own unique experience with the book. The TV show is Ryan Condal's interpretation of that text, and thus the changes the show makes, and choices in terms of the narrative that Condal made, and some of the fundamental differences from the text, does not influence the canon of the books. What we are seeing in House of the Dragon is one writer's interpretation of events based on how he views the characters and different sources we have access to. For example, Condal's now famous blood and cheese green propaganda quote. But the point is, the show is the show, and the book is the book. But even when the book is the book, there are still some complications. The first version of the Dance of the Dragons we get in a more detailed form is from the Princess and the Queen, and to some extent the Rogue Prince. In a way, these were early drafts of the story that we see told in Fire and Blood, with the narrative greatly extended in the final story Fire and Blood gives us. But there are a few key differences between the two versions of the story that kind of have an impact, especially with this discussion regarding Otto and Daemon, which is something we will delve into shortly. But namely, some details established in the novellas were changed for Fire and Blood. The two that immediately jump out to me is Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, the Queen Who Never Was, having silver hair, not black hair, in the novellas, and the rumoured affair between Alicent and Daemon Targaryen prior to her marriage to Viserys, which was strangely omitted and replaced with a different rumour in Fire and Blood. Why George made these kinds of changes, we don't know, and given his lack of comment in terms of what is canon, specifically in terms of these novellas as well, we can't just go with the text we have, given the text itself is conflicting itself. For the record, when I make my videos, I tend to sway more towards Fire and Blood, with the idea that it was George R. R. Martin's final intent with the story, in a way that The Princess and the Queen wasn't. But you cannot wholly dismiss the novellas. In fact, I would argue House the Dragon resembles The Princess and the Queen slightly more than it does Fire and Blood, to the point I've seen some argue that House the Dragon is in fact an adaptation of The Princess and the Queen, rather than Fire and Blood. Especially when you consider that the Princess and the Queen in question are the two main characters in House the Dragon in Rhaenyra and Alicent. There are a lot of theories about how Otto and Daemon came to dislike each other so deeply, but in the text itself, specifically in Fire and Blood, all we are really told comes after the death of King Jaehaerys and the rise of Viserys, where it is mentioned quite clearly that Otto disliked Daemon and tried hard to keep him away from positions of power. While the feeling was most certainly very mutual for Daemon, a man who seemed to play the game by his own rules and could perhaps see through the facade Otto had erected over his time as Hand of the King. So we know they don't like each other, and we are given clear examples of actions they took against the other. But oddly, what is never delved into in the text is exactly how this dislike began and how quickly it happened. Was there one key event that caused this rift? Did it happen over a long period of time, or short? Or was it simply their conflicting goals, meaning it was inevitable there would be tension between the pair? And this is where the novella Princess and the Queen comes in. Even when I read the novellas, this isn't something I picked up upon until I saw someone point out the changes between the Princess and the Queen and Fire and Blood on Reddit. I started to question things. In Princess and the Queen exists a rumour that before her marriage to Viserys, Alicent had an affair with Daemon, with this event being the root cause of Otto's hatred towards the prince. In Fire and Blood, this was replaced with a different rumour altogether with nothing to do with Alicent, which is why, as we have discussed, its status in canon is questionable. But if this rumour was true, it would go a long way in giving us a starting point for Otto and Daemon's rivalry, and why it seems so much more deeply personal for Otto. The issue here is, given the source of the rumour itself, there is a very high chance that it is just gossip. But in the text that we do know is canon, Fire and Blood, there are some other indications as to how this feud could have begun, and at the very least why it escalated to the point it did. We're talking about the relationship between Otto and Daemon, and why the two men came to despise each other so deeply. We have to look at how they fit into the dynamic of court during the early reign of Viserys. When Viserys came to the throne in 103 AC, Otto had already been Hand of the King for Jaehaerys since early 101 AC. While being an established hand by the time Viserys came to the throne already put Otto in a powerful position, we also have to remember he had also effectively been ruling the realm himself for the last 2 years as Jaehaerys' health continued to decline. Thus, when Viserys did come to the throne, Otto was this guiding figure during this transition period, and while Otto personally had less power and freedom under Viserys, who was a much more active king than the infirm Jaehaerys, in being that supporting figure during the transition, Otto had gained the trust and confidence of Viserys. Daemon, on the other hand, in his youth, had already gained the reputation for being a bit of a wildcard, unpredictable, and well, the rogue prince he is rightly remembered as. It seems he had always been fiercely loyal to his brother, so much so that in the wake of his father's death in 101 AC, the then 20-year-old Daemon managed to rally a small force of swords to defend his brother's claim to the throne when he heard that Corlys Velaryon had begun to rally his own fleet to press the claim of his son Laenor Velaryon. It is often forgotten that if the solution provided by the Great Council of 101 had not been put forward, there is a real possibility bloodshed may have occurred. It was an incredibly bold move by Daemon, and in many ways cemented his unpredictable reputation. From Daemon's rash actions in 101 AC in rallying his small army, we do learn one key thing about about him. He does seem protective of his brother, or at the very least his brother's rights to the throne. It seemed that Daemon may have felt somewhat threatened by the influence that Otto has over Viserys. Being protective means he might distrust the kinds of men who whisper in the king's ear, men like Otto Hightower. Thus, even at the start of Viserys' reign, the positions and outlook of both Otto and Daemon inadvertently set them up against each other. You have a man, such as Otto Hightower, with a strong influence over the king, then someone like Daemon, who very much tries to protect his brother. From the get-go, I think it's clear they were never going to be easy friends or colleagues. From Otto's point of view, this wildcard aspect of Daemon, especially when you're trying to run a kingdom, could be quite destabilising to an extent. But on a personal level, Daemon is perhaps the one other person at court who Viserys will listen to, and thus that effectively reduces Otto's own influence and power. Daemon's rogue nature, Otto's inability to predict and control him, kind of weakens Otto's position and power and control over Viserys. But that's the thing. Daemon does not like Otto having the king's ear the same way Otto dislikes Daemon having the king's ear, for the same reasons. But ultimately, any transition of power is a difficult time. You have no idea how relationships will develop and form, and many things are in flux. There are many cases where a new king comes to power, and with him half the small council are removed and replaced with his own choices. Thus, during these times, there was always a level of uncertainty and tension, which in turn isn't conducive in building good working relationships as men jostle for position and favour. When you take a step back and look at Otto and Daemon's relationship objectively, while Daemon is open about his disdain for Otto and his relationship with Viserys, in the period between 103 and 105 AC, when Daemon was a much more active part of court and the small council, Otto seemed to publicly attack Daemon more openly. When Viserys named Daemon as Master of Coin in 103 AC, it was Otto who petitioned the king to remove Daemon from the role. In truth, Daemon was poorly suited for the role of Master of Coin, thus Viserys named him Master of Law. Again, Daemon would only be in the role for 6 months until again he's removed from office, with Otto citing his lack of interest in governance. The fact Viserys listened to Otto and removed his brother from these roles means one of two things. Otto truly did have the king's ear as Daemon feared, or while frankly Daemon was just not really suited to the roles he was given. Daemon was made the commander of the City Watch, a more practical martial role, and that seemed to suit him better. A role in which Daemon thrived much to Otto's dismay. With 2,000 men at his command, he rose more powerful than ever. Daemon inspired loyalty in a way Otto could not, especially with the many of the rank and file men at the City Watch, improving their armaments and equipment. He gave every man a gold cloak, which led to the guard becoming known as the Gold Cloaks even into the time period of the main books. Crime fell sharply under Daemon's control of the City Watch, likely due to his love of inflicting harsh punishments on thieves and cut purses. However, painting Otto as a key force behind this rivalry is not a truly balanced view of events. There were aspects of Daemon and his motivations that might rightly worry Otto, not just Otto, but any sensible hand of the king. While on paper Daemon might seem to be this protector of his beloved brother loyal to Viserys, we have to remember he gained a reputation as a rogue prince for a reason. A huge factor at play here that might make Otto question Daemon's motives comes from the fact that via male preference primogeniture, Daemon, until a living son is born to Viserys, is technically his heir. So if Otto views himself as a loyal servant to Viserys, he would rightly view Daemon as a potential threat to Viserys. We know that Otto's fear should Daemon ever find himself on the Iron Throne is he would become another Maegor the Cruel. While I personally don't think Daemon would perhaps be as extreme as Maegor, given his reputation, it's not difficult to see why Otto would be concerned at the very least. Plus, given what we know about Viserys being the kind of king who would always try and find compromise and see the best in people, Daemon could be a very real blind spot for Viserys. Otto was so concerned about the idea of Daemon becoming king, he actively backed the idea of Rhaenrya being named Viserys' heir, breaking with hundreds of years of tradition and the precedent of the Great Council of 101 AC, just to prevent Daemon from having such a strong claim to the throne and lowering his position from heir to third in line, nullifying much of his political threat to Viserys. Hell, Otto was advocating for Rhaenrya as heir, when in a few short years later later, he'll be back fighting for the rights of tradition and precedence when it comes to his grandson's rights as heir to Viserys. So when you take a step back and look at the personal and political situation between 101 and 105 AC, it's not hard to see why the two men found themselves at the opposite sides of the table. What is most compelling here is, in a way, both Otto and Daemon's fears about the other did end up coming to pass. Otto would use his position as Hand of the King to push for his own blood as heir to Viserys, and Daemon would still find a way to secure power and position as close as he could to the Iron Throne via his marriage to Rhaenrya, and inevitably the birth of his sons. And that's why this dynamic is so fascinating, because both men's fears and dislikes of the other fueled the other's rise in some capacity. But in truth, I think there is actually a much more simple answer to all of this. Often, two very similar people will clash and not get on as well as you might first think. The reality is, Otto Hightower and Daemon Targaryen have more in common than both of the men themselves and the wider fan base want to really admit. They share many key traits. Both are very ambitious men looking to further themselves, and in Otto's case, his family too. To reach these goals, you have to have a drive and determination, something Otto has displayed in his rise as Hand and general influence over Viserys, while Daemon, while yes, being more of a rogue or wildcard, would take several hugely ambitious steps to further his own position, namely his time as the so-called King in the Narrow Sea and his pursuit of Rhaenyra. Something else that is also really important to understand is both men are also second sons, with few prospects on inheritance and positions or power. In fact, it's very possible Otto is even less than a second son, given how vague the Hightower family tree is. All we really know is he's not the eldest son. While Daemon is technically heir, his position is weak, and one that will only become reduced if and when Viserys has more children. Both men had to work and fight to carve out their own place in the world. Given the high-level game both men are playing in order to reach their ambitious goals, they both require the intention, favour and goodwill of one man, King Viserys. So if we ignore the rumours and speculation, in essence their rivalry is born in the pursuit of being in Viserys' good graces in order to achieve what they want for themselves. It seems to me that in a way they kinda seek the same thing. First of all, to forge themselves a lasting legacy, which sets them at odds with each other. Both of these ambitious driven men hate each other because they are two sides of the same coin. In the end, regardless of the outcome of the Dance of the Dragons itself, it's fair to say both men did get what they wanted in the end. A lasting legacy, for good and for ill.